So who we've got to be in the call with now?
Oh, just oh fuck, no. Stop. Should we just so this is OPP discussion groups from Michaelmas, and we're just gonna be doing this entire series on different themes in Africana philosophy. And our first speaker today is Chike Jeffers, and our moderator today is Jonathan. And we're just going to be talking about what is Africana philosophy. Very excited to learn, and I'll just pass on to Jonathan to introduce Chike.
Sure. So yeah, thanks for inviting me, OPP. It's really lovely opportunity to be sort of moderating this first critical discussion group on Africana philosophy. So I'm Jonathan. I'm doing a PhD on the Ethiopian philosopher Zeri Yacob, and the sort of surprisingly controversial and contentious question over whether he existed. So today I'm going to be hosting the discussion with Professor Chike Jeffers. Professor Jeffers is an associate professor in philosophy at Dalhousie University. He's written really widely on topics in Africana philosophy and philosophy of race. Most recently, there's this book, which is a kind of four-way philosophical discussion on the concept, what is race, with Sally Haslanger, Keishon Spencer, and Josh Glasgow. You might also know him from as the co-host with Peter Adamson of the fantastic History of Africana Philosophy series. If anyone hasn't heard that, I'd really recommend you to go and have a look. It's this sort of spectacularly broad sweep of ideas from ancient Egypt, medieval Timbuktu in Ethiopia, diasporic thinkers in Haiti, Brazil, America. And there's, just to sort of give a very quick plug, there are some excellent episodes on my area of specialization, which is Ethiopian philosophy again. And Professor Jeffers is going to be speaking at the In Search of Zeri Yacob conference, which is being organized by myself and Philimiналity Oxford to take place, perhaps in person, certainly at some point in the coming year, hosted by Worcester College. As we've mentioned, the first and sort of fitting question for the first of these discussion groups is going to be, what is Africana philosophy? So I'll pass that over to you, Professor Jeffers.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and also for the kind words on the podcast. I believe that the 2 episodes of the podcast were mentioned as sort of background for this discussion, along with some of Lewis Gordon's book, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy. I think where I would like to start is actually with an autobiographical note, because I chose philosophy as a career through getting to know Africana philosophy, which I also think of as a bit of a luxury in terms of when in time I came to philosophy as a profession. I was in my 3rd year of my undergraduate degree at York University in Toronto, Ontario, where I am from. I was in my 3rd year when I put philosophy as a minor. I'd been planning to study film, and I switched from film production to film studies as I began to realize I was more attracted to the academic side of things. And I had read philosophy outside of class time that made me think, well, I'm really interested in this, and it would be at least fun to have it as a minor. And then in that 3rd year of my undergraduate education, I was able to take a course on African philosophy. And I came across randomly in the bookstore of my university a book called African American Philosophers, 17 Conversations, edited by George Yancey. And between that book and the course, I went from thinking philosophy is something fun that I would like to learn more about, and that it would be nice for that to be part of my education. I went from that to, oh, well, I think this is what I want to make my career in. And so knowing about Africana philosophy as a disciplinary formation is what really brought me into philosophy as a career. And as I was reflecting and preparing for today, I thought back to how I photocopied and put in a binder 2 special issues of the journal Philosophical Forum. One being the 1977-1978 issue, winter, spring, or something like that. And then this 1992-1993 issue, I don't remember what the seasons that they would have associated with it were, but those 2 issues of that journal were dedicated to Black philosophical thought, let's put it that way. In the second of those 2, that is in the 1992-1993 issue, we find Lucius Outlaw's article, African, African American, Africana Philosophy. And that article, I would say, is really what put Africana philosophy as a term out there in a way that could then be taken up by other scholars. Lewis Gordon being one of the scholars who did the most, really, to begin in the 90s, promoting that term within philosophy. But yeah, given that, I myself would have already been 10 years old, I guess, 10 or 11 years old at the time that Outlaw published his article. In that sense, the term is not super old, but it is, I think, a very useful term. And it is identified in that article and in subsequent writings by Outlaw on the field as an umbrella term, as a term that is covering African philosophy, but also African American philosophy, Afro-Caribbean philosophy. Importantly for me, in terms of an article that I'm very proud of called "Do We Need African Canadian Philosophy?" That too would be covered by the term. And so, because it is a term that covers philosophy as it emerges from the African continent and from the African diaspora, then we can say that to pay attention to Africana philosophy is to think about how philosophy looks different when we decenter Europe and its particular historical journey from antiquity to modernity, and center instead at least 2 alternative stories to linked and to linked stories of humanity. One, the story of the African continent as a whole, but also with a particular focus on the sub-Saharan part. So philosophy as it emerges from within Black Africa, and philosophy as it emerges in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade, which is such a centrally important feature of modernity. It is truly hard to overestimate and to overemphasize the importance of that particular social and economic process in the making of the world as we know it. Something that I, as a person of Afro-Caribbean descent, am keenly aware of, because it is the process that results in my own existence. So, what does it mean to put all these various stories from the African continent, from these various parts of the African diaspora, as Jonathan was mentioning. You've got Haiti, you've got Brazil, you've got the United States. What does it mean to put it all together? And is there the worry that to put it all together is to create a false unity, to homogenize that which is in fact very diverse and perhaps divergent? That is a worry that at times some listeners to the podcast that was mentioned, that I co-write, that I co-author with Peter Adamson, The History of Africana Philosophy. I was, in fact, surprised by the ways in which a number of listeners questioned whether we were doing something sort of illegitimate and problematic in telling the story of Africana philosophy. And it's interesting to think about this matter by thinking a little bit about Frantz Fanon, the Martinican philosopher, psychoanalyst, revolutionary, a truly important figure of the 20th century. It's interesting to think about this question of the unity of Africana philosophy in relation to him. Because one might say that in the introduction to his first book, Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Masks, that he does caution against the problem of overgeneralizing. So toward the end of the introduction, he says, as those of an Antillean, our observations and conclusions are valid only for the French Antilles, at least regarding the Black man on his home territory. A study needs to be made to explain the differences between Antillians and Africans. One day, perhaps, we shall conduct such a study. Perhaps it will no longer be necessary, in which case we can but have reason for applause. That is the final paragraph of the introduction to Black Skin, White Masks. Right? And so it's a specific case of Fanon cautioning not to confuse the specific subject matter that he is investigating with something that could count for, be expressive of the situation of all Black people, all people of sub-Saharan African descent. So interestingly, in the comment section of the first episode of the podcast, which we entitled Something Old, Something New, Introducing Africana Philosophy, there's a lot of comments if you go to the comment section there, and if you pay close attention, you can see when I'm getting frustrated at some of the hostility that the very existence of the series was provoking. But to continue to pursue this question, it's interesting that at one point someone was continuing to object to what it means to group things together as Africana philosophy. And in this person's comment, he or she referred to Frantz Fanon and said how he or she is happy that Fanon and also W.E.B. Du Bois, who I specialize in studying, that this person said, well, these are some of my favorite writers. I'm pleased that they will be covered, right? But the person was suggesting again that there's maybe something wrong in what the context that they were being covered in was, in terms of this idea of Africana philosophy. And interestingly, and to me a bit mysteriously, the person said, I'd note here that Fanon himself looked down on African religions. So I just want to read a little bit of my response to that person on April 9th of 2018. I said, let's take for granted the claim you make about Fanon looking down on African religions. He's not always easy to interpret, so I don't know that I fully agree, but I want to grant it for the sake of argument. What does this mean to you? Does this somehow raise a question about including him in a series on Africana philosophy? Fanon, who joined the Algerian Revolution, and how relevant it is that he is inextricably linked with Algeria, given all the suggestions that we are wrong to make reference to North Africa. That's me alluding to things that had been said in the comment section. Fanon, who goes to represent the provisional government of Algeria in Ghana. Fanon, who shortly after his death thoroughly inspires and shapes the thinking of Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale as they found the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. Fanon, who is today claimed as an ideological founding father of the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is a political party represented in the legislature of South Africa. It seems to me that Fanon is a fine example of a philosopher whose thought and influence is best understood and contextualized precisely through an Africana frame of reference. Why should his position on African religions be taken to suggest otherwise? Why shouldn't it instead be taken to strengthen the point, given that having something to say, negative or positive, about religion in Africa is a sign of the importance of Africa as a reference point in one's thought? And then the comment continued, but that's the relevant portion that I wanted to read. And I would honestly say that, you know, in retrospect, I underplayed the point. I could have spoken about how important negritude as a movement in art and thought was for Fanon as a point of reference, including as a point of critique, but also to some extent also inspiration and critique. And to consider that, you have to talk about Leopold Senghor, who was a poet and then eventually the first president of independent Senegal. And you have to talk about Aimé Césaire, who, if I recall correctly, maybe even taught Fanon at one point. Césaire was from Martinique, also a poet, also a politician. And the friendship that those two, as well as Léon Gontran Damas from French Guiana, the friendship that those three had in Paris in the 1930s, right, led to this, was key in leading to this important movement in thought known as negritude. It's interesting that in both Black Skin, White Masks, where he has this focus on the Antillean or West Indian experience, and the Wretched of the Earth, his later book, which is focused very much on Africa, in both of these books, negritude plays some importance, again, as something partly to criticize, and partly to criticize because of what he thinks is wrong with certain forms of cultural homogenization. Right? But what you notice when you see him quoting and referring to, for example, in the famous 5th chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, the negritude thinkers, both Senghor and Césaire. And also, if you pay attention to who else he quotes there, a number of African-American writers as well, everything shows this Africana thought space, this thought space that cannot be reduced to even the Francophone Black world, but is completely transnational, transatlantic, cannot be reduced to one part of what is best recognized as the larger space of Africa and its diaspora. It is understandable that people want to avoid homogenization and overgeneralization. And it is true that the African continent is vast, but there could be a temptation to think about the African continent as big and huge, and there's lots of different peoples within it, and they speak lots and lots, thousands of languages, depending on how you differentiate languages. And this can lead to thinking of it as this, thinking of it culturally as this random assortment of various points, right? You want to resist the fact that people have ignored the diversity of Africa. And maybe you're tempted to then just see it as, all these different cultures, and we shouldn't confuse any of them with each other. But that way of thinking of a place like Africa as a, random assortment of various points is misleading and confusing. Consider, for example, the Bantu Expansion. So beginning around probably 5,000 years ago, peoples who had been somewhere in West Central Africa, if you would look on a map, you want to look from Western Nigeria into Cameroon. So people from that area began to migrate to different parts of the continent. And it was a very long process, but by the end of the process, the Bantu language family had expanded from that area in West Central Africa to the point where now you go all the way to the bottom of the continent. You go to South Africa, and the major languages of South Africa, the major indigenous African languages of South Africa are Bantu languages, languages like Zulu and Xhosa. And then, but then it's also that expansion went, and I said east. I said Western Nigeria, and I meant Eastern Nigeria earlier. But you go east also to East Africa, and many of the major languages in East Africa, languages like Kikuyu, and many of the languages of Tanzania, right, in East Africa, are Bantu languages, right? And if you think of, right there in the middle of the continent, the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Most of the important languages, indigenous African languages there, are Bantu languages, right? It is a story then of not just a random assortment of points, but the circulation of people, and in this case also the circulation of languages, right? And it's the kind of thing that should make us think about the circulation of ideas. And then when you get to modernity, you have the modern story of the circulation of bodies, cultures, and ideas outside of the continent, especially through the impact of the transatlantic slave trade. And to break pieces out of this story, like the African-American piece, or the Jamaican piece, or the Haitian piece, or the Brazilian piece, to break pieces out of the story and to treat them in isolation, in my view, is to understand these pieces more poorly than you would if you put them in the context of the larger story of Africa and its diaspora. So I'm going to try and wrap up so that we can have a discussion, but a few interesting questions that certainly came up as we made this podcast is, first of all, where does the story of Africana philosophy start? And I think it is an interesting aspect of the series that we put forward as a possible answer, that the start of Africana philosophy is the start of philosophy itself, because we suggest that if we don't restrict the meaning of what philosophy is to a cultural occurrence that begins in ancient Greece and then is only exists insofar as what people are taking up is what was done in ancient Greece. If we don't restrict what it means to talk about philosophy that way, which is important if we, for example, want to talk about Indian philosophy, if we want to talk about Chinese philosophy, right? So if we want to talk about all those things too, as philosophy, and so we don't restrict it to what was born in ancient Greece, it is not unreasonable to think that really philosophy is as old as the linguistic and conceptual capacities that allow us to engage in it. And if so, it seems reasonable to think that philosophy was born where we developed those capacities, and it is reasonable to think that we developed those capacities in prehistoric Africa. We then, as was mentioned by Jonathan, spent time talking about how far back we can trace Africana philosophy in writing, and we explore ancient Egyptian philosophical thought, which is a rich tradition in my view, and that I have done some publication on. And then as we move forward in time, well, then there's the question of what else counts, right? Arguably some of the biggest names in Western philosophy. If you think of ancient philosophers like Plotinus and Augustine, both of them were African, Plotinus from Egypt, Augustine from what is now Algeria. We don't have episodes in our series on them, and you could say that one reason is that Peter had already covered them in his series on philosophy in later antiquity in the original podcast series that predates our series on Africana philosophy. But we also, as you may have heard in the first episode, engaged the question of when is it illuminating to call something Africana philosophy? And should we think that the Greek and Latin philosophical writing that we find during in North Africa during the Roman era, should we think of that as Africana philosophy? Right, we raise it as a question, but something that I'll say that we didn't say in the podcast is it's interesting to think of Alexandria, the city, as a place of distinctive importance, a meeting place of cultures that is specifically within Africa. And insofar as we do that, we might think of Plotinus's birth in Egypt and then the time that he spent at Alexandria as part of a distinctively African story. But again, something that we didn't, pursue that thought in the podcast. We consider oral traditions, which present interesting difficulties for telling history, right? Because of if you study, for example, Proverbs, or even as in the case of the Ifa tradition of the Yoruba people, there are verses, divinatory verses, which clearly I think have philosophical content, but we have no idea how old they are. And so in terms of telling history, there are interesting challenges there, right? But they are a very rich resource, the oral traditions of the continent, for philosophical thought. And to think about African philosophy as something that is a self-conscious enterprise, that is a 20th century invention. That is, in terms of not tracing what could possibly count as African philosophy, but when people did stuff that they explicitly named as African philosophy, right? That is a matter of the 20th century, and as a development was completely wrapped up in questions of how to excavate oral traditions, or in reaction to attempts, the question of whether we shouldn't look to oral traditions. And so African philosophy ends up coming with these very important meta-philosophical questions. Right? What should count as philosophy? And there are ethical and political implications of the answers that one gives. As we move into part 2 of the series, which we're currently in part 2, although that is coming to an end, and part 3 of the series will be coming soon. But part 2 of the series we call Slavery and the Creation of Diasporic African Philosophy. And it's interesting to note that at one point in part 1, we're speaking of the Sokoto Caliphate, which was a 19th century political structure, but then headed by very philosophically minded leaders. And so that's why we discuss it. But that's a matter of the 19th century. And the first episode, episode 29 of part 2, we end up spending some time talking about Juan Latino, a poet who wrote in Latin in the 16th century. So in that sense, we've somehow jumped back in time, you might say, in our story. But it's important. Why? Because we cover the Sokoto Caliphate as part of covering pre-colonial African philosophy, whereas Juan Latino is part of the story of the incorporation of Black voices into the West through writing in European languages, such as Latin in the case of Juan Latino. And there is part of a poem of his that we quote in the episode, where he says, if our Black face displeases your ministers, O king, a white face does not please the people of Ethiopia. Over there, when a white man visits the East, he is looked down on. The leaders are Black, and the king there is dark. So his book of poetry is arguably the first, well, I won't say arguably, I think probably the first book in a European language by a sub-Saharan, an author of sub-Saharan African descent. And it's interesting at that point of the incorporation of Black voices into this Western story to see also the way that he in that poem points to the limits of a European point of view and the importance of Africa. And so the last thing that I just wanted to mention, and then I look forward to conversation, is in the Lewis Gordon text that was also you were also encouraged to take a look at. He argues on page 13 that one question dominates Africana philosophy and has become increasingly central since early modern times, namely, what does it mean to be a human being? Right. So philosophical anthropology, as he names it, he thinks of that as the distinctive theme of Africana philosophy. And I think that it would be a problem or not necessarily helpful to go too far in sort of pressing that point. And I would encourage one to encounter Africana philosophy in a very open-minded way about what are going to be the distinctive themes. And so not to rely too much on Gordon as sort of giving us a lens there. But it is a very useful and important lens because the story of African peoples and peoples of African descent in the modern era is a story of responses to dehumanization. And today, with the phrase Black Lives Matter, we see another attempt to claim humanity on behalf of Black people. And the fact that that is the project that we are still engaged in, I think, is as good evidence as one could ever need of just how important the study of Africana philosophy is. So those are the opening remarks that I wanted to make, and I thank you for listening.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thanks for all of these sort of Connected. Yeah, wasn't really sure whether to try and do clapping like this or with the things popping up on the screen. I can see a few of them coming up. I'll basically try and start the discussion by just offering a few sort of connected question, comment related things, and then if you have a response, and then people can jump in with different things if they have questions to ask. You can either do that by raising your hand on the Zoom function. I'll be able to see most of it, or if you want to put your video on and actually physically do it. Also, if you want to ask a question in the chat, I can try and relay it to Chike. Okay, but so the thing that I was one of the things I was particularly interested in there is the idea, number one, of the sort of ultimate unity of something called Africana philosophy, and then also the idea that with the emergence of the diasporic communities in the New World, with the sort of traumatic events of the triangular trade and slavery, there's a kind of rupture as well. And I'm interested in just sort of thinking about, number one, how this kind of rupture works such that there is a useful continuity that we can still understand as being part of the same concerns and interests, and then the difficulties that any kind of diasporic philosophy is going to have in terms of having to use so many of the conceptual, linguistic tools of the communities that they're living in. One of the parallels I was finding very interested in, one thing that I think about quite a lot, is the history of Jewish philosophy as also being a diasporic philosophy, one which is often having to be written in those languages. Also, incidentally, when you were talking about Alexandria, I realized that not only is there a good claim that philosophy in general begins in Africa, but Jewish philosophy certainly begins of a sort with Philo.
Yes.
Exactly.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah, and that's not something I think I would have ever really clocked before. So yeah, I suppose I'll leave that out there, maybe as just a general comment to pick up on rather than a specific question. We can sort of go from there.
Yeah, and I'll try and be brief because I've, of course, already spoken, I think, more than I was even asked to, and thus want to hear more from other people. But I think that the thing I want to point out right away is that there is something importantly right about seeing the transatlantic slave trade as a kind of rupture, a point of rupture, right? But with regard to understanding Africana philosophy as something that is unified, to be honest, it is arguably the opposite of a point of rupture. It is arguably where unity, I mean, at the extreme, one might say it's where unity originates. That is to say that the process of enslavement and the process of the reshaping of identity in the Americas and even in Europe, right? As in cases like Juan Latino, but also we can think of people who ended up in Europe, like Cugoano, Ignatius Sancho, and so on. Identifying as African is so much a product of that experience. And so if African and Black as identities, and in fact, it's sometimes easier for people to understand how Black as an identity is something that really, is elaborated in the context of the New World, but people will forget that African itself, the Old World, so to speak, for that to be understood as a unified identity of any kind, is so much a product of what happens outside the continent in the situation of being enslaved. And so in that regard, as I say, that traumatic process is not the rupture of something that we can, call African identity or African philosophy, but really a point at which it becomes a self-consciously unified thing.
I will follow up with another related question, unless anyone wants to jump in, but please do at any point. So, oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, like please finish your question, but I think there is someone in the group called Diaspora who does have a question. Just that.
Okay, sorry, I can't see all the faces. Yeah.
Was that me coming to the top of the queue?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, thanks. I'm sorry I arrived late and have to leave early, so I'm really grateful to you guys for listening to the question now. I'm sorry if this was covered already. But I was wondering about sort of the danger of essentializing when running under the banner of Africana philosophy. And it's a methodological question about the extent to which those who write under that banner or who speak in the oral case under that banner want to be concerned with the sort of historical baggage that has been applied to them in the past. And I say it's a methodological question because, you know, standardly in philosophy, you consider objections and you advance your case by considering obvious retorts that other people might have. But where those obvious retorts have come from.
Oh, sorry, your microphone, or
Yeah.
I can't hear as well. I don't know what happened there.
Oh, sorry, I'll try and write my
Okay.
question.
No, we can hear you again.
Oh, okay. So sort of, I was thinking that it sounds absurd if someone calls themselves a Hegelian or a Foucaultian. People understand that they come from the continental tradition, and it would sound absurd for someone coming from that tradition to worry about being essentialized. People would understand, would situate them within a broader tradition, within a narrow tradition, wouldn't take them to have the same views as every other Hegelian or every other continental philosopher. So my question is, to what extent should people writing or speaking under the banner of Africana philosophy be worried about other people perceiving them as essentialists, because we know that this is wrong?
Yeah, well, I feel like your answer points the way. That is, it's not something to be, I think, overly concerned with. You show that you are concerned to not essentialize and overgeneralize in how you practice and how you articulate your ideas, but you don't, I think, show it by being overly worried about whether people will perceive the banner itself as by nature essentializing. You may have heard when I was discussing the comments section on the first episode of the podcast, or if you didn't, I spoke about how there's quite a lot of comments on that page and a lot of worry that people have about Africana philosophy and as a unity. And I did my best to, as calmly as I could, engage with said perspectives. And I've tried to articulate in my remarks today some of what is important and meaningful about seeing it as something unified. But, of course, it is certainly my preference, whenever possible, to kind of like leave all that as understood and just get to the work of exploring the ideas. Because yes, it is obvious to me how fruitful it is to pursue the history of thought through the Africana lens, and so whenever possible, do the work.
Yeah, well, with all of these methodological considerations, there's always there's a sort of interesting dilemma in the sense that like you mentioned with the question of how we're supposed to understand oral traditions in philosophy, the debate that often gets called ethno-philosophy and sage philosophy raises all of these metaphilosophical questions, which we can really go have a really deep dive into. But also there does come a point where you're like, can we get to the philosophy? Like, part of the point is that this has been so neglected, and you know, you don't want to be getting bogged down in these questions.
Yeah. When I took the course on African philosophy that I mentioned, and we dived into the methodological or metaphilosophical debate and the critiques of ethnophilosophy and so on and so on. Yeah, I remember that a fellow student complained to me saying, you know, I expected to come and learn some African philosophy. You know, they were gonna, you know, this is not what he said, but I think the spirit of his comment was something like, you know, I wanted them to tell me about the Zulu conception of this and the Somali conception of that, and the, you know, and where's all of that? Why are we doing all this metaphilosophical stuff? Which I don't even think he would have used the word metaphilosophical, right? But he was bothered, and I remember that the fact that I was not bothered and that I was loving it was one of the signs that I was maybe cut out for philosophy.
Certainly. Yeah. And I mean, I suppose on the other end, we've got another problem, which is the Placide Temples style of thing, where there's absolutely no reflection on the actual, well, that's maybe being a bit cruel, but there's not so much of the reflection on what exactly it is he's doing, and he's just saying, oh, this is what the Bantus think about the ontology of force or something like that. So there's sort of twin issues. Got something in the chat. Oh, that's sorry. Yeah, sure, Ashley, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chike, for that like brilliant talk. It was really interesting. I guess since this talk is about, you know, what is Africana philosophy, I've got a question sort of about the like developing definition of Africana philosophy, which, and I did think it's central to what Africana philosophy is, but it's a question that I came up with, and that's that what can it mean for Africana philosophy, and what could it mean for Africana philosophy for people who don't descend from Africa within modernity to engage in Africana philosophy?
Yeah, that is a good question. And it is one that I explicitly consider in a paper of mine that I mentioned, Do We Need African Canadian Philosophy? Because the structure of that paper is that I rephrase the question of the title in a number of ways. And one way that I rephrase it, so to speak, is can anyone do African Canadian philosophy? And so what I have to say about this is extends also to Africana philosophy more generally. And so I make a distinction between, well, actually, so let me first say, so I do say that anyone can do Africana philosophy, but I make a distinction in terms of what doing is between producing and working on. So I mentioned that I have a friend, Eli Diamond, who he and I had gone to grad school together, and then we ended up at the same university, although he's in the classics department and I'm in the philosophy department. So there is a very understandable sense in which we could say that he does ancient Greek philosophy, right? What do you do? And, you know, oh, I do ancient Greek, right? At least if you say it sort of quickly and not thinking about it, it makes sense. But of course, if you say it and you start thinking about it too hard, then it starts to be like, wait, you can't do ancient Greek philosophy. You're not an ancient Greek person, right? But of course, it's easily resolved if we think about the distinction between saying that he is someone who works on, who studies ancient Greek thought, right? Versus someone like Plato, someone like Aristotle, those being people who produced ancient Greek philosophy. And so that is what makes sense to me when we modify the term philosophy with sort of people group terms, right? That you have to, in some sense, be of the people group to produce that kind of philosophy. However, people of any background can work on that type of philosophy. That is to say, they can study the ideas, and they can, to some extent, since studying the ideas, as we do it in philosophy, generally means, not just saying what people have said, but engaging, right? Philosophically considering arguments, considering objections, and so on and so on. Yeah, they can engage in the debates that have arisen through the production of, Africana philosophy. But yeah, that is sort of the distinction I would make. I mean,
what do you think it could mean for philosophy or for society to have this increased engagement with Africana philosophy?
Well, I mean, I think that yeah, as I tried to suggest, it means better understanding, Africa itself, and through better understanding Africa itself and the African diaspora, better understanding modernity, better understanding where we are in human history, because of how important to the story of human history Africa and the creation of the African diaspora are.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got another question from Rohan Kaya. I'd like to ask you a question directly, Rohan.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Jeffers, for that talk. That was really fascinating, and I'm really glad. So my question is kind of slightly building off what Ashley said about engagement within philosophy. Then do you think Africana philosophy now kind of intersects with politics, and to what extent do you think it can influence or have a role in political developments right now? For example, as you mentioned, Fanon was absolutely involved, and someone like Huey Newton as well, although maybe maybe not producing like lots of writings like Fanon, still was very much a philosopher, but very much someone who worked and engaged directly every day. And I'm wondering what you think about the possibilities for the future and for now regarding politics and philosophy, or Africana philosophy.
Yeah, well, I think that there are lots of possibilities. I think that given that Africana philosophy as a modern, as it has developed within modernity, and as it has developed as a self-conscious enterprise, it is so naturally wrapped up in political questions, social and political questions, that I mean, the link to politics is always going to be in some sense intrinsic. I mean, you are of course raising the question of the link, not just in subject matter, but in terms of, how, in the political sphere broadly, Africana philosophy can or cannot play a role. And I mean, yeah, I do think that the possibilities are pretty endless. I mean, as a very simplistic way of making this point, I mean, there's so often that leaders, Black political leaders, write philosophically engaging works that repay attention from the Africana philosophy standpoint. And this even goes for someone like President Obama. The fact that he wrote his first book, Dreams from My Father, when he was not yet a politician, is very helpful, because I think that he would not have been, I think he would have been more careful in unfortunate and restricting ways had he already been a politician at the time he wrote it, but he wasn't. And so that book is, well, it's famously autobiographical, but I mean, what many people don't know is that he intended to not write something, he intended to write something on race, and it became more autobiographical. And so it is, as a result, still, even though it's an autobiography, an interesting reflection in many ways on race. And yeah, so I mean, just as a simplistic example of taking, someone who exists in the political sphere, and not necessarily the example that everyone would want. Like if you've just been thinking about Fanon, Obama is not necessarily the example you want to go to next. But that being said, I think the example stands as just how easy it is for these spheres to be connected. But I'll also say that those of us who don't want to ever, let's say, be, on the front lines in some political sense, whether through, formal politics that is like standing for office, or even in terms of heading up, let's say, activist organizations. Those of us who, and I don't necessarily include myself, I don't rule those things out as things I would never do per se, but imagine if I did, right? Those of us who really just want to, let's say, be academics, I think have a role to play, right? Because in terms of education, so the link to politics cannot die at the level of content, right? Just because, yeah, you're just doing it wrong if somehow it drops out at the level of content. But at the level of, not everyone's going to be Fanon, right? And and some people are just going to be scholars, and they are super important at this time in the development of Africana philosophy as a field. Is where I think I'll end that comment and that answer.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Okay. So you mentioned at the end of your talk about how the distinctive theme of Africana philosophy has been the question of what it means to be a human being. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that idea links or it sits in relation to ideas of Afro-pessimism, and how Afro-pessimist thought conceptualizes Blackness.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, yes. So I mentioned, right, Lewis Gordon identifying that as the central theme of Africana philosophy, and I, and I tried to also suggest it's important to take that with a grain of salt. It's important to, I think, yes, not use that as too constant of a lens, because I think one can, I think it's insightful when taken as a point of how we can connect themes, but I think, yeah, it's important that I wouldn't say it in my own voice, because I wouldn't want to restrict Africana philosophy to sort of like, yeah, this is the central thing myself. So that's what I would first sort of put out there. what is interesting is Gordon himself is very much a critic of Afro-pessimism. And yet, I think, you know, Afro-pessimism as if we understand Afro-pessimism as a sort of development within Africana philosophy, understanding Africana philosophy broadly, since it's not originating primarily from those who are, you know, trained philosophers, but understanding Africana philosophy broadly, it is a movement within Africana philosophy. And it really, I think, in that sense, actually does sort of validate or points toward the insightfulness of Gordon's identification as of the question of what it means to be human as such a central question, and of course, you know, taking in some forms a very radical and surprising approach to answering that question. There are limitations for me in what I'm going to want to try and say. To any, you know, for me to say anything further, I'm going to feel very limited in terms of, I think there's so much more for me to read and really try and think about, and a lot of it is not an easy read when it comes to Afro-pessimism, that I don't want to say a lot more about its answers, and I tend to find myself sympathetic to many critiques that I read of it, but I myself try not to sort of just wholeheartedly endorse said critiques, because yeah, I still want to take the time to understand more what is trying to be said. Yeah, so that's what I'll say about that. Jonathan, we can't hear you.
I was just scrolling along to see if we had any other questions there. Just one short thing to follow up on your point, and then we'll go straight to Alice, was just about the relevance of Afrikaner philosophers to political developments. There's a wonderful recent book by Adom Getachew, World Making After Empire. And that seems to me to be a sort of really clear example of how, you know, huge political changes were made in a relatively short period of time by a fairly short generation of thinkers inspiring other ones, you know, like C.L.R. James and George Padmore and Du Bois, you know, and Nkrumah was reading this. And when you were talking about philosophically acute politicians, I was thinking, you know, there probably isn't one in the 20th century more than Nkrumah. So that was just a very small point to add. If you want to answer that, or we can go straight to Alice.
Well, I mean, the thing the brief comment that I'll make is that yes, the sort of first generation of especially leaders on the African continent, you know, it really brings you to that point of thinking of philosopher kings when you think of Nkrumah, but also when you think of Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, when you think of Leopold Senghor of Senegal, right, and to some extent others, right, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia. I mean, you can sort of go on. I mean, this how much one can get from the writings of that generation of African leaders. I mean, it will, you know, beyond I would say maybe like the big three, Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Senghor, I might call them the big three. Then, you know, there could be diminishing returns for others, and yet it is such a crucial time that, you know, it's interesting to read how they're thinking of things, and of course, in many cases, you know, how some of these leaders understood what it meant to have a one-party state and what's going on there, right? I mean, and then you can, but then you can also, you know, think about what Caribbean leaders are saying and thinking at this time, including, you know, like Michael Manley of Jamaica, and then when you have the Grenadian Revolution, you know, Maurice Bishop. And interestingly, you can even think about, you know, what the first generation of African-American mayors are saying about what it means in the wake of the Black Power movement in the early 70s for them to be ascending to power in the ways that they were, and you know, and like was it Maynard Jackson? I mean, like, I'm thinking of whoever was the first Black mayor of Atlanta, and anyway, there's really interesting ways to pursue, you know, that theme across different spaces.
Thanks. Okay, Alice, do you want to come in on the next one?
Thanks, and thank you so much again.
Thank you.
My question relates, and I'm bringing it up just because I thought it related to some of the things that were being said earlier, but it relates to a podcast episode when you joined Peter Adamson.
Yes.
And you mentioned that if you hadn't been a philosopher, by doing this podcast and working the podcast series, you might have been interested in being like now a paleoanthropologist. And related to some of the things that have been said, I'm curious what this means to you, and also to some of the other notions that might be related to anthropology and well, not just colonialism, but just as a discipline, but also I know where some people use it as a way to empower philosophy, and it might be a way to find resources as well when they're not there, but it's also being accused as being like problematic. And so I'm wondering what it means to you, and if it's tempting, how to do it responsibly and how it would relate to philosophy.
And the it there, to be clear, was anthropology?
I know specific paleoanthropology, but anthropology, however you want to take that.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Because I started to think that that you were maybe not just referring to paleoanthropology, especially when you were referring to, you know, anthropology as problematic, or as sometimes viewed as problematic. I was thinking that you maybe were talking about the development of the discipline of like social and cultural anthropology, or maybe was I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking of both. I think so.
Okay.
I was wondering what that would mean to you and what it would mean to bring that into philosophy, or why you would find that interesting, be using that when you're doing philosophy.
Yeah. No, excellent question. And yeah, so just to sort of say for those who may not have listened to the podcast, episode 28 is the final episode of part 1, and is a conversation between Peter and myself reflecting on what we've looked at thus far. So soon enough, he and I are going to record another one of those as we bring part 2 to an end. And so I said that, you know, when I sort of dived into the material for us to begin thinking of the development of philosophical thought as potentially something happening in prehistoric Africa, I think that I think that part of what can be attractive about philosophy is how it leads us to kind of confront that which is puzzling, that which is mysterious, right? Philosophy will ask us to think, well, you know, you believe this thing, but it seems like you also believe this thing. So how do those fit together? And insofar as that's part of what's attractive about philosophy, I guess what I had started to feel in that moment where I had the thought, Why wouldn't it have been cool in another lifetime to be a paleoanthropologist? Part of what I started to just feel is that there's no greater mystery and puzzle when it comes to understanding who we are than to think about how we developed at the level of language and thought in the situation where we know we can't have the kind of direct confrontation with that something like writing brings, up until roughly 5,000 years ago. And yet, clearly, our developments as linguistic, social, conceptualizing beings, right, extends way, way, way before that. And you have the issue of, well, it's one thing to find a footprint or a stone tool, right? But how do you find the origins of religion? How do you find the origins of, some of these various aspects of how we think? How do you find the origins of art even, right? Obviously we have some very old cases of art, right? And how do we understand how we came to be the types of beings that do all that? So the just the sort of like amazing detective work, so to speak, that is involved in paleoanthropology seems to me like, wow, that's sort of like exciting field to have to try to help us understand who we are in that fashion. And what I'll say is that was an experience that I had while preparing for us to write episode 2 of the podcast. When it comes to social anthropology, as I think is historically called in Britain, or cultural anthropology, as it's more often called in North America, I already knew that I loved that. It's one of the things that I thought about majoring in when I was in undergrad, and it's, I always found it interesting. I mean, yeah, there's worries about how anthropology as a discipline grows up in the the context of colonialism. What does it even mean also for anthropology to be this thing where Europeans are tending to understand that as the study, well, sorry, in terms of, like, let's say ethnology, right, or social or cultural anthropology. What does it mean for Europeans to be understanding that as the process of studying other peoples, and then, to some extent, studying themselves gets counted as sociology, right? These are some of the kind of conceptual and historical issues around the growth and development of anthropology as a discipline. Actually, yeah, it's actually at my university, it's called social anthropology. Yeah, we have the department that we call SOSA, which is sociology and social anthropology. But what impressed me even as an undergrad was that precisely because its connections to things like colonialism were so clear, I found in some ways it was a discipline that kind of like couldn't hide from hard questions. Other disciplines would sometimes be able to just get away with not thinking about colonialism and its importance. And I feel like anthropology, as it developed over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st, couldn't escape such questions. And that to me was positive. And then, another way to put it also is that social anthropology, when we think about the theoretical underpinnings, and what does it mean as a discipline that would have, of course, important empirical components, but, have certain theoretical questions that it is constantly probing. I mean, the central question right? There is what is culture. And I love that question. And that question's super relevant to how I engage in my work as a social and political philosopher contributing to Africana philosophy and also philosophy of race. So yeah, in that sense, you know, anthropology as a discipline is very important to me. And I remember fondly some of the textbooks that I had and how exciting it was for me to begin thinking of even like how various important anthropologists along the way were trying to define culture and things of that nature.
Thank you.
Okay, we might have time for one last one if somebody is wanting to jump right in ahead right now. If not, you've probably heard enough of my questions. And I'm going to have.
But if you have them, we you know, I think we still have about 10 minutes, so you can feel free to ask them.
All right. Well,
it looks like we do have a question.
Yeah, Justin, please.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I was trying to formulate this question, but I'm gonna start, so I'll just go. Background, I'm from
Barbados.
Yeah, you got me.
Yeah, man. It didn't take you long to talk, and I heard it. You can't hide. You can't hide at all.
Yeah. So yeah, I went to UK Phil. And in terms of the politicization of African philosophy, I wanted to point out how kind of striking it is that at UE they source specifically African philosophers. They had the philosophy department. So the philosopher who taught me was Ocheng Odiambo, who worked with Oderuka, so sage philosophy, that kind of thing. And then they had Nigerian philosophers and Mona, I think. And
yes, that's right.
That's such an advantage, I think, at least for, you know, a Black population, to when they're going into philosophy, they have that kind of resource where they have someone with that kind of and willing to teach that kind of thing. Kind of on the, I kept thinking of when I was doing my African philosophy course in undergrad, you know, we had these exchange students, like white students from the US. And I distinctly remember them saying, you know, I thought in this course we were going to be doing African philosophy, not just talking about African philosophy.
Right. Sort of like the story I told earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, that struck me as kind of, on one hand, yeah, I want to do African philosophy instead of just the meta philosophy, but it's also kind of frustrating because the reason there's so much meta philosophy to do with that is because there's so much delegitimization going on. So African philosophers be constantly defending themselves. But at the same time, you know, you have the undergrads coming in and being like, well, where's the actual philosophy?
Sure, right, yeah. No, it's a good point. Oh, sorry, if you weren't finished, let me let you finish.
No, if you have something to say, go right ahead.
I was gonna say that I think you're right that, you know, it's like the metaphilosophical aspect is deeply related to forms of delegitimizing. I mean, honestly, you know, for so long, it was extremely common for, if you were to mention the phrase African philosophy to the average person trained in, say, North America or Europe, it sounded to them like an oxymoron, you know? And that's really important. Now, at the same time, I think that on the flip side, you have the question of what it means to study the thought of African people under the heading of philosophy, right? I think that if you, let's say, come from a starting point of, well, African people have have had interesting and important thoughts. And I think that we can sort of say that that's the starting point that you'll come from when you are recognizing them as human. but when you start at that starting point and then you say, well, okay, so what does it mean to consider it under the heading of philosophy? I mean, it is still relevant to think about how that term itself is a Greek term. What we mean by it is going to somehow be related to the invention of that term in ancient Greece. And I think that's, again, the flip side to what I was saying about we shouldn't think that philosophy was born in ancient Greece, right? But the flip side to that is the term certainly was, and that's going to shape how we think about it, right? And so it's worth sort of asking the question, right? Well, is this field, as it has been constituted as an academic field, specifically within the history of Europe and European dominated societies, right? Is that category actually the useful one within which to study the thoughts we want to study, right? Now that's a question that I have clearly answered yes to. So it's not that I doubt philosophy as a category being a useful way to approach many of the interesting thoughts that have emerged from Africa and the African diaspora. But it is a critical question to ask, right? So that's sort of, what I would say, which is still going to your point about how the metaphilosophical debate necessarily has its place. And I'll mention that I've gone to, a conference on Senghor at Cave Hill back in the 2000s, which was a really great time. And I've spent time around Ochieng, and I've also been to a conference at Mona as well. And so I know what you're talking about in terms of, who's teaching there. And it's, and I get what you were saying about that. I do, of course, hope that we will, over time, have increasing numbers of philosophers from the Caribbean holding positions in growing philosophy departments at Mona, Cave Hill, and wherever else, right? That to me is also important. But yes, I do think that there is a nice and important benefit from the perspective of seeing Africana philosophy as a certain kind of unified conversation that you have people like Ochieng at Cave Hill and Bawaji at Mona and so on.
Yeah, and if I just follow up briefly, I mean, I ended up studying Indian philosophy, so I'm something of a unicorn, right? Context, and that's been a struggle to kind of try to, do it as philosophy, because in that case, so often you go into departments and it's more text-based.
Religion.
Yeah, it's well, you have to just study the text, and well, if you want to do it as philosophy, you have to flex a bit. And I found, a lot of people, I think, across academia end up doing what they want to do in departments that they don't necessarily identify with.
Sure.
Because, these are just arbitrary kind of distinctions, and it's more about finding who is doing what where to get it done. Just getting the work done is, I think,
yeah, and I hope that you have gotten the chance to listen to the podcast on Indian philosophy, which, if you and this is information for everybody, if you are trying to subscribe to the podcast that I'm involved in on any kind of podcast supporting app like Spotify or whatever, then what you should look for is History of Indian and Africana Philosophy, because there's sort of two podcast feeds, right? The one is the original series that he started in 2010, which can just be called The History of Philosophy without any gaps. But then he has this, he had to create a separate feed where there was first I think it's about 62 episodes on Indian philosophy. And we're 61 episodes into the Africana series. There's going to be a lot more to come. But then after that, he's actually going to do Chinese philosophy next, working with Karen Lai. He worked with Jonathan Ganeri on the series on Indian philosophy. But also, I will say that when you just go to the website itself, which is at the very easy to remember, historyofphilosophy.net, you know, in that sense, it is indicative of the fact that it's all part of the history of philosophy without any gaps, because you can just find, you know, the newest episode as it comes up right there, you know, and it alternates week by week, right? So he's in the Italian Renaissance in the original series. And so the Sunday coming will be the next episode in that series, but just the Sunday past, we posted the episode on Anna Julia Cooper, one of my favorite thinkers. And so I encourage you all to check that out. You know, next up, so not Sunday coming, but the Sunday after that will be Ida B. Wells. Yeah. And anyway, thank you, Justin, for your question.
No, thank you.
That's taken us up to exactly past. So I'd like to, and I'm sure I'm speaking for absolutely everyone here, where we say we really, really, really thank you for coming and joining us for the first of these discussion groups. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I just encourage everyone to go off, listen to the podcast, read Chike's articles, especially some of the ones that we've mentioned today, the Do We Need an African Canadian Philosophy and all of the other stuff. So I'll not try and lead another virtual round of applause, but just say thanks one more time.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you being here and all of your wonderful questions. Yes, I do encourage you to check out the podcast and my stuff, but of course, what I hope above all is that today would make you interested in Africana philosophy in general. So whatever you read, you know, I hope that, you know, you'll read some more of that. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
invitation coming. This has been amazing, and it's been so good to hear from you and like everyone who asked the question and attended the discussion group. It's been great.
Well, I enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much.
We can also share the resources you mentioned. We'll send them out afterwards as well. And then hopefully we can see people next week. I think we have one on Thursday, or it's Wednesday next week?
Yeah, I think so.
And also Thursday. So.
Oh yes, yeah. So yeah, we're doing oral tradition next week. African philosophy.
With whom? Who's your speaker next time?
Samuel Limbo.
Yes. Samuel Limbo is great. And here's yet another podcast plug, because we did an interview with him on the podcast. So I'm glad that you all will be able to chat with him. He's also just a very nice guy.
Yeah.
Very personable.
Yeah.
No, that's actually the learning resource that we've shared for that one. So it's a good plug.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Great. Cool.
All right.
I will stop the recording here.